When the municipal grid collapsed and temperatures plummeted to 30 below, 400 people realized they were going to freeze to death. The only thing standing between them and the ice was a towering, rusted monstrosity of scrap metal they had spent the last 6 months relentlessly laughing at. Oakhaven was the kind of town that liked things exactly the way they had always been. Nestled deep in the jagged, pine-choked valleys of the Colorado Rockies, it was a place where generations of families lived in identical weatherboard houses, bought their supplies from Mitchell's Hardware, and trusted the hum of the county power lines like they trusted the sunrise. Then came Victoria Sky. Victoria wasn't from Oakhaven, and she certainly didn't blend in. A 34-year-old former systems engineer from Chicago, she had moved to the mountains, seeking quiet after a grueling career in corporate infrastructure. She bought an old, isolated property on the ridge overlooking the town, a sprawling acre of weeds and a dilapidated cabin that everyone assumed she would bulldoze to build a modern mountain retreat. Instead, Victoria started building a monster. It began in early August. Deliveries of strange materials started arriving at the ridge. Heavy-duty PVC piping, coils of industrial copper wire, deep-cycle marine batteries, and sheets of corrugated aluminum. When Victoria began making daily trips to the local junkyard to haul away rusted Ford F-150 alternators and discarded tractor-trailer axles, the town's curiosity curdled into suspicion. By October, the structure had taken shape, and it was undeniably ugly. Standing 35 feet tall, tethered by thick steel guy wires, driven deep into concrete anchors, it was a vertical-axis wind turbine. Unlike the sleek, white, three-bladed turbines seen on commercial wind farms, Victoria's creation looked like a post-apocalyptic egg beater. The blades were fashioned from hammered aluminum roofing, bolted to a reinforced central drive shaft. At the base sat a heavily insulated shed housing a crude but brilliant power inversion and storage bank. The town hated it. "It's an absolute eyesore, and it's destroying my property value," Brenda Walsh declared during a heated Tuesday night town hall meeting. Brenda lived half a mile down the ridge and had made it her personal mission to see the turbine dismantled. She slammed a manila folder onto the folding table in front of Mayor Thomas Harding. "She doesn't even have a permit for a commercial structure." Mayor Harding, a man who preferred to avoid conflict at all costs, sighed and adjusted his glasses. "Brenda, the county zoning board already looked into it. It's technically classified as an auxiliary residential outbuilding. There's a loophole. As long as it doesn't exceed 40 feet, she's within her rights." "Have you heard the noise it makes?" Brenda demanded, looking around the room for support. "When the wind picks up, it sounds like a dying helicopter. Whoosh, thump, whoosh, thump. It's driving my golden retrievers insane." Victoria, who was sitting in the back row wearing a grease-stained Carhartt jacket, finally stood up. The room fell dead silent. "The noise is under 50 decibels at the property line, Brenda," Victoria said, her voice calm but unyielding. "That's quieter than your husband's riding mower. And the reason I built it is because Oakhaven is sitting at the absolute end of the county power grid. The substation in the valley is 40 years old. If a severe weather event hits and takes down the main transmission lines on Route 9, we are completely cut off. No plows, no repair trucks, no power." Greg Mitchell, the owner of the local hardware store, let out a loud, mocking laugh from the second row. "Come on, Victoria. We've lived here our whole lives. We get snow every year. The county always gets the lights back on in a few hours. You're building a spaceship to prepare for a doomsday that isn't coming. I'm building redundancy, Victoria replied coldly. Because hoping the power company cares about 400 people at the end of a blocked mountain pass isn't a strategy. It's a gamble. The room erupted into groans and laughter. They dismissed her as a paranoid prepper, an eccentric city girl who didn't understand the resilience of mountain folk. Over the next 2 months, the mockery became a local pastime. Teenagers would drive their trucks up the ridge road, shine their high beams on the spinning metal tower, and honk their horns. At the grocery store, cashiers would ask Victoria if she had managed to contact Mars yet. Victoria ignored them. She spent her days fine-tuning the pitch of the aluminum blades, calibrating the voltage regulators, and sealing the battery shed against moisture. She knew the math. She had analyzed the historic weather data and the failing infrastructure of the regional grid. She knew that Oakhaven was a disaster waiting to happen. She just didn't know it was going to happen on the 14th of February. Meteorologists initially called it a standard low-pressure front. Sweeping down from Canada, the National Weather Service predicted 8 to 12 inches of snow for the Colorado high country, a routine winter event. But weather in the Rockies is a volatile beast. As the front collided with a massive, unseasonable atmospheric river pumping moisture from the Pacific, it stalled directly over Oakhaven. The barometric pressure dropped so fast it caused eardrums to pop. It started at 3:00 p.m. By 5:00 p.m. the snow wasn't falling. It was firing sideways like white shrapnel. The wind howled through the pines at sustained speeds of 60 miles per hour, bringing with it a catastrophic temperature plunge. In the span of 2 hours, the thermometer outside Mitchell's Hardware plummeted from a mild 28 DGF to 15 DGF, and it was still dropping. The wind chill pushed the ambient temperature into the lethal zone of 40 DGF. At 7:14 p.m., the inevitable happened. Deep in the valley, the aging substation that Victoria had warned them about finally gave out. A massive pine, its roots compromised by the freezing ground and its branches heavy with ice, snapped violently and crashed directly through the main transmission lines. A bright blue flash illuminated the stormy sky for a fraction of a second, followed by a concussive boom that echoed up the mountain. Then, Oakhaven went black. Every house, every street light, every glowing window vanished into the roaring dark. At first, the town reacted with routine annoyance. People lit candles, threw an extra log into their decorative fireplaces, and wrapped themselves in blankets. It was just a power outage. It would be fixed by morning. But by midnight, the reality of their situation began to creep into their homes like an invisible predator. Modern houses in Oakhaven were heavily reliant on electricity. Without power, the gas furnaces couldn't run their blower motors. Electric baseboard heaters were useless. Well pumps died, instantly cutting off the fresh water supply. Inside Brenda Walsh's house, the temperature had already dropped to 42 degrees. She sat huddled on her expensive leather sofa, wearing 3 coats, violently shivering as she listened to the horrifying sound of her plumbing pipes groaning as the water inside them began to freeze and expand. Her husband had tried to start their portable Honda generator, only to discover the fuel lines had frozen solid in the uninsulated garage. Down in the village, Greg Mitchell was faring no better. The large windows of his hardware store, designed to show off inventory, were now bleeding heat at an astonishing rate. His emergency propane heaters had run out of fuel within 3 hours. The storm showed no signs of stopping. The snow was already 3 feet deep, burying cars and completely erasing the roads. No repair trucks were coming. No ambulances could make it up the pass. They were trapped in a freezing coffin. High on the ridge, however, the scene was entirely different. When the grid failed, Victoria's house went dark for exactly 4 seconds. Then, with a heavy clack, the automatic transfer switch engaged. Outside, the brutal 60-mile-per-hour winds that were torturing the town were feeding Victoria's monster. The vertical axis design, specifically chosen because it didn't need to point directly into the wind to function, was spinning furiously. The rusted Ford alternators screamed, generating a massive influx of kinetic energy that poured down the heavy gauge wires into the battery bank, converting to pure, life-saving alternating current. Inside Victoria's cabin, the lights glowed warmly. Her electric space heaters hummed, holding the interior at a comfortable 68 degrees. The kettle on her electric stove whistled, and she poured herself a cup of Earl Grey tea. She walked to her window, wiping away the condensation, and looked down at the valley. It was a terrifying sight. The entire town of Oakhaven was swallowed by blackness, completely invisible in the raging whiteout. But as she took a sip of her tea, a sudden, violent shudder rocked her cabin. The lights flickered violently. Victoria froze. Outside, the steady whoosh thump of her turbine had changed. It was no longer a rhythmic heartbeat. It sounded like a jet engine spinning out of control. She rushed to the monitoring panel on her wall. The voltage meters were redlining, the needles bouncing erratically. The wind speed had crossed 80 miles per hour, hurricane force. The turbine was spinning too fast. If it surpassed its structural RPM limit, the centrifugal force would tear the heavy aluminum blades apart, turning them into deadly projectiles and destroying the only source of power for miles. The automated electromagnetic braking system she had built had failed. The freezing temperatures had snapped the relay wire. No, Victoria muttered, slamming her tea mug down. If she didn't manually engage the mechanical emergency brake at the base of the tower right now, the entire system would explode. But going outside into an 80-mile-per-hour blizzard at 30 below zero was effectively a death sentence. Skin would freeze in less than 2 minutes. The wind would knock the breath from her lungs. The lights in the cabin surged brightly, the bulbs whining under the excess voltage, threatening to shatter. Victoria had no choice. She grabbed her heavy insulated coveralls, strapped on her ski goggles to protect her corneas from freezing, and wrapped a thick wool scarf over her mouth. She grabbed a heavy steel wrench and clipped a carabiner to her belt, knowing the wind could literally lift her off her feet. She kicked the front door open. The force of the storm hit her like a moving train. The sound was deafening, a physical pressure that crushed against her chest. She couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of her. The cold pierced through her layers instantly, biting into her bones like liquid nitrogen. She anchored her carabiner to the safety line she had rigged along the porch rail and began to pull herself toward the screaming, vibrating tower of metal in the dark. Every step was a battle against the whiteout, and the monster she had built was threatening to tear itself apart, right when she, and as she would soon realize, the rest of the town, needed it most. The wind did not just blow, it screamed. It tore at Victoria's insulated coveralls with the force of a physical assailant, trying to rip her off the icy wooden steps of her porch. She dropped to her hands and knees, clipping her carabiner to the nylon safety line, and began to crawl. The snow was blowing horizontally, a blinding white static that rendered her high-lumen headlamp entirely useless. She navigated purely by the terrifying sound and the violent vibrations traveling through the frozen ground. 10 yards, 5 yards. When she finally reached the base of the turbine, the sheer kinetic fury of the machine was paralyzing. The central drive shaft, a thick column of salvaged steel, was spinning at a dizzying blur. The rusted alternators were emitting a high-pitched, ozone-scented shriek. The concrete anchor pads were physically shaking. If the central bearing failed now, the 35-foot tower would shear off and crush her cabin. Victoria frantically wiped the ice from her goggles and lunged for the emergency mechanical brake, a heavy cast-iron wheel connected to a pair of industrial friction calipers. It was encased in 2 inches of solid, clear ice. "No, no, no!" she screamed, though the wind snatched the words from her mouth. She raised the heavy steel wrench she had brought and smashed it against the ice. The metal rebounded, sending a shock wave up her arm that felt like shattered glass. She hit it again, harder, screaming with the effort. The ice cracked. She hammered it a 3rd time, fracturing the shell enough to expose the rusted iron wheel. Victoria gripped the freezing metal with her thick gloves and threw her entire body weight into it. It wouldn't budge. The calipers were seized. Above her, a horrific metallic groan echoed through the shrieking wind. The upper strut was beginning to warp under the centrifugal force. She had seconds. Bracing her heavy winter boots against the concrete housing, Victoria gripped the wheel, closed her eyes, and pulled with a desperate, primal strength. Muscles in her back tore. Her lungs burned with the sub-zero air. With a deafening crack, the ice holding the calipers shattered. The wheel gave way, turning half a rotation. Sparks rained down over Victoria's head like fireworks as the heavy brake pads slammed against the spinning steel shaft. The friction was so intense, it immediately smelled of burning metal and melting snow, but the shriek of the alternators began to drop in pitch. The blur of the aluminum blades slowed into a visible, rhythmic rotation. The violent shaking in the concrete subsided. Victoria collapsed into the snowdrift, gasping for air, her chest heaving. She had stabilized it. The monster was tamed, but it was still churning out massive amounts of power. She clipped back onto her line and dragged herself back to the warmth of the cabin. Down in the valley, there was no warmth. There was only the creeping, silent grip of death. Inside the Walsh residence, the temperature had plummeted to 26 degrees. Brenda Walsh was crying. Not from the cold, but from sheer terror. On the living room floor, buried under a pile of sleeping bags, her husband, Tom, was taking shallow, ragged breaths. Tom had severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. For the past 3 years, a steady stream of concentrated oxygen had kept his lungs functioning. But his oxygen concentrator was dead. His 2 small backup tanks had run dry an hour ago. Without the machine, Tom's blood oxygen levels were crashing. His lips were taking on a terrifying shade of blue. "Tommy, breathe. Just look at me and breathe," Brenda sobbed, rubbing his freezing hands. "Can't catch it, Bren," he wheezed, his eyes fluttering shut. Brenda grabbed her cell phone. No service. She grabbed the landline. Dead. The storm outside was a roaring wall of black and white. No ambulance was coming. No fire trucks. Oakhaven was buried. In a panic, Brenda ran to the window to see if Greg Mitchell's house next door had any light. Perhaps he had fixed his generator. But Greg's house was a pitch-black silhouette. As Brenda stared out into the apocalyptic darkness, a brief break in the squall revealed the high ridge overlooking the town. There, cutting through the swirling blizzard like a lighthouse in a tempest, was a solitary, glowing yellow square. Victoria Sky cabin window. Brenda's heart stopped. She has power. "Greg!" Brenda screamed, throwing open her front door and plunging into the waist-deep snow on her porch. She waded off the steps, the cold instantly piercing her jeans, and screamed toward the neighboring house. "Greg! Help!" A minute later, Greg Mitchell's front door opened, revealing the hardware store owner bundled in hunting gear, holding a flashlight with a dying battery. "Brenda, are you crazy? Get inside," Greg yelled over the wind. "It's Tom. He's suffocating. We have to get him up the ridge, to the city girl's house. She has power." Greg looked up through the storm, squinting until he saw the impossible yellow glow. He looked back at Brenda, realizing the gravity of the situation. It was nearly a mile up a steep, unplowed, heavily wooded dirt road. In this weather, it was a suicide mission. But staying in the freezing valley was a guaranteed death sentence for Tom. "I have a plastic hunting sled in the shed," Greg yelled. "Get Tom bundled up. We're dragging him." It took them 45 minutes to cover the first half-mile. The snow was chest-high in the drifts. Greg harnessed himself to the front of the heavy plastic sled, pulling with everything he had, while Brenda pushed from behind. Inside the sled, wrapped in a tarp and heavy blankets, Tom was barely conscious, his breaths reduced to terrible, rattling gasps. The wind chill was tearing at their exposed skin. Greg couldn't feel his toes. Brenda's eyelashes were frozen together. The humiliation of what they were doing, crawling desperately toward the home of the woman they had spent 6 months publicly ridiculing, was entirely eclipsed by the primal need to survive. "Keep moving!" Greg roared, his voice cracking as he slipped on a patch of black ice hidden beneath the powder, tearing up his knee. He scrambled back up, fueled by adrenaline. Up ahead, the rhythmic whoosh-thump of the turbine cut through the howling wind. It was the most beautiful sound Brenda had ever heard. They reached the porch at 3:15 a.m. Greg didn't even knock. He just collapsed against the heavy wooden door, pounding his frozen gloved fists against it. "Help, please! Open the door!" Brenda screamed. The deadbolt snapped back. The door swung open, releasing a wave of hot, 68-degree air that hit the freezing trio like a physical blow. Victoria stood in the doorway, exhausted, a wrench still in her hand. She looked down at Brenda, then at Greg, and finally at the tarp-covered sled. "It's Tom," Brenda choked out, falling to her knees on the porch. "His lungs. His machine is dead. Please, Victoria. Please." Victoria didn't hesitate. "Get him inside. Now!" Victoria dropped her wrench and helped Greg drag the sled into the center of the living room, quickly slamming the door shut against the howling blizzard. The cabin was an oasis of impossible warmth. The electric baseboard heaters were clicking steadily. A row of LED lights illuminated the room brightly. Brenda frantically tore the blankets off Tom. He was completely unresponsive, his face a horrifying, pale gray. "Where is the machine?" Victoria demanded. In his bag," Greg stuttered, his teeth chattering so violently he could barely speak. He fumbled with a frozen zipper on a duffel bag they had thrown into the sled, pulling out the heavy Philips Respironics oxygen concentrator. Victoria grabbed the cord, sprinted to the heavy-duty power strip connected directly to her inverter bank, and slammed the plug in. She hit the power switch. For a terrifying second, the inverter on the wall whined loudly, the cooling fans kicking into overdrive to handle the sudden surge in electrical load. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Then the oxygen machine beeped. The compressor roared to life, churning out a steady stream of purified oxygen. Brenda ripped the plastic cannula from the machine, jammed it into Tom's nose, and cranked the flow rate to the maximum. She collapsed over his chest, sobbing hysterically. For 10 minutes, the only sounds in the cabin were the desperate gasps of Tom Walsh, the humming of the oxygen compressor, and the steady, rhythmic whoosh thump of the turbine outside. Slowly, miraculously, the blue tint faded from Tom's lips. His chest began to rise and fall with regular, deep breaths. He opened his bloodshot eyes, looking confusedly at the wooden ceiling beams. Greg Mitchell slid down the wall and sat on the floor, peeling off his frozen gloves. His hands were bright red and shaking. He looked around the cabin. He saw the electric kettle. He saw the glowing power meters on the wall. He saw the complex, beautiful array of deep cycle batteries neatly wired in the corner. He looked up at Victoria, who was pouring a cup of hot water from her kettle. She walked over and handed it to him. Greg took the warm mug, his hands trembling. He looked down at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I am so sorry, Victoria." "Drink the water, Greg," Victoria said quietly. "You're in shock." Brenda looked up from her husband. Her face was streaked with tears and melted snow. "Victoria, we made fun of you. I tried to have the county tear it down. And you let us in." "I built it to keep the lights on, Brenda," Victoria replied, pulling a thermal blanket from a closet and draping it over Tom. "I didn't build it to win an argument." But Tom, Brenda, and Greg were only the beginning. By dawn, the storm had not broken. The snow was 4 feet deep, and Oakhaven was still locked in a frozen death grip. But others in the valley had seen the glow from the ridge. At 7 a.m., Mayor Thomas Harding arrived with his wife and 2 young children, all suffering from mild hypothermia. At 9 a.m., the local baker, David Reyes, dragged his elderly mother up the hill on a piece of plywood. By noon on Wednesday, there were 22 people huddled in Victoria Sky 1-bedroom cabin. The living room looked like a refugee camp. People were sleeping shoulder to shoulder on the floor. Victoria was no longer just an engineer. She was the commander of a life raft. She stood by her inverter panel, playing a high-stakes game of electrical mathematics. The turbine was generating a massive continuous output, but 22 people required heat, hot water, and medical equipment. "All right, listen up," Victoria announced, clapping her hands to get the room's attention. The exhausted, shivering townsfolk looked up at her with absolute reverence. "We are pulling 4,000 watts right now. The battery bank is draining faster than the turbine can top it off. We have to stagger the load. Greg, turn off the space heater in the bedroom. We run it for 15 minutes every hour, no more. David, you can use the hot plate to boil soup, but only when Tom's oxygen concentrator cycles down to low flow." "You got it, Victoria," Mayor Harding said immediately, scrambling to his feet to help David with the canned soup they had brought. "Whatever you say. You're the boss." For 6 agonizing days, the blizzard raged and the county grid remained completely dead. Inside the cabin, the social hierarchy of Oakhaven completely dissolved. Greg Mitchell, who had mocked Victoria at the town hall, spent hours sitting by the battery bank, meticulously logging the voltage readings, just as Victoria taught him, terrified of letting the power drop. Brenda Walsh took charge of rationing the food and melting snow on the electric stove for drinking water. Outside, the ugly, rusted, scrap metal monster continued to spin. It fought through 80-mile-per-hour gusts. It chewed through ice storms, and it never stopped. The hammered aluminum blades and heavy Ford alternators became the beating heart of Oakhaven's survival. On the 7th day, the wind finally died. The snow stopped falling, and a blindingly bright Colorado sun broke through the clouds. Down in the valley, the town was buried up to the roof lines. The silence was absolute. But at 2 p.m., the deep, mechanical rumble of heavy diesel engines echoed up the pass. A convoy of massive Yellow County snowplows, followed by 4 utility trucks, finally broke through Route 9. Dave Peterson, the lead lineman for the Regional Power Company, parked his truck at the edge of the Oakhaven limits. He stepped out into the 4-foot drifts, looking at the dark, freezing houses with a sinking feeling in his gut. They had been without power for a week in negative temperatures. He was prepared to find a town filled with casualties. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, we're at Oakhaven. It's a ghost town. No smoke from the chimneys. I'm requesting emergency medical extraction teams. I don't think anyone made it." "Hey, up here!" Dave spun around. Coming down the plowed ridge road was a parade of 22 people, wearing layers of mismatched winter gear. At the front of the pack was Mayor Harding, supporting a frail older man, followed closely by Brenda Walsh and Greg Mitchell. They looked exhausted, unwashed and battered, but they were alive. Dave stared in sheer disbelief. How are you people not frozen to death? The substation exploded. You had no heat for a week." Greg Mitchell stepped forward, a weary, profound smile cracking his weathered face. He pointed a thickly gloved finger up to the top of the ridge. Standing against the clear blue sky, its rusted blades slowly turning in the gentle morning breeze, was the turbine. "We had power," Greg said quietly. "We had Victoria." 6 months later, Oakhaven didn't look the same. The town was no longer entirely dependent on the vulnerable county substation. Instead, standing proudly on the hills, surrounding the valley, were 4 brand-new, vertically aligned wind turbines. They were professionally built, sleek, and integrated into a town-wide emergency microgrid. The project was entirely funded by the residents, spearheaded by an aggressive fundraising campaign run by Brenda Walsh and Greg Mitchell. But the original turbine, the rusted, loud, scrap metal I saw built from truck parts and PVC pipe, was never dismantled. It remained on Victoria Sky property, spinning away, a towering monument to the woman who saw the storm coming when everyone else just saw a clear sky. If this story of survival and ingenuity kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves incredible real-life engineering tales, and hit subscribe so you never miss another intense story of human resilience. Drop a comment below. Would you have the skills to build a survival turbine like Victoria did? Let us know.